My name is David K. Miller. I've been a resident of Racine County for about the last 8 years. I grew up in Waukesha County. I lived in Milwaukee County for many years. My mother's parents grew up in the city of Racine. I am not an author. I'm not a published or unpublished. Well, I'm not an author. I will confess to having a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. And my lecture will be writing your family history in 6 parts. And the first part will be, I'll be talking about the tools and resources that are available for doing research and writing your story. Part 2, I'm going to talk about the types of genealogical writing that you can do. Part 3 will be kind of an English lesson on literary conventions. Part 4, I'm going to have a real life example, researching while you write. Part 5, I'm going to enhance the story with a DNA match. And in part 6, I'm going to take a field trip to the place that I was researching. So, tools and resources. The first thing you need is a decent computer with word processing software. If all you have is a smartphone or a Chromebook or an iPad or something like that, you're going to be seriously hampered. You also want a flatbed scanner for photographs and documents and a printer. Optionally, you can have a camera or a smartphone and some kind of Photoshop software. However, with Microsoft Word and PowerPoint, you can actually crop photos. You're going to want an internet connection and or a library card. You're going to want an online family tree that is either online or PC based. And you're going to want free library and or subscription access to public records such as the census, travel, military, birth, marriage, and death records. And optionally, you're going to want the results of 1 or more DNA tests to access the public family trees of your DNA matches. Now, because of word processing software, there is no longer any excuse for bad spelling or poor grammar. This is what I had available to me to create this presentation. This should not be construed to be an endorsement of any of the said products or services, though. I have Microsoft Office 365, which includes Word, Excel, PowerPoint. I have Corel Paint Shop Photo Pro. You may, it's very helpful, when you're cropping and resizing photographs. I have a World Explorer subscription to Ancestry.com. I once had full access. Full access also includes Fold for military records and newspapers.com. I have Family Tree Maker 2019 PC software, and it syncs with my Ancestry.com online tree. So if I make a change on my online tree, it will make the change on my my Ancestry online database and vice versa. I also have full access subscription to myheritage.com. I have a subscription to Genie Pro, which is a subsidiary of myheritage.com. And I also have a free account, an online account on Family Search, which is the LDS website. The last two, I think maybe it's pronounced Genie Pro and Family Search, those trees are actually collaborative trees, so you don't actually own them. So if you put up a profile, somebody else could make a change to them. And I have access to my autosomal DNA results and matches, as well as those of my dad's sister, her daughter, my sister, a niece, and 2 second cousins who are first cousins to each other, with their permission on both Ancestry DNA and MyHeritage DNA. And I've also taken the Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA results from family tree DNA. And I might add that Chuck Johnson, who is on here, has done 1, 2, 3 and me. Does anybody have any questions up to this point?
I do. So how many DNA tests have you taken? Or with how many companies? All of them that are available, or?
No, I've just Ancestry DNA and MyHeritage DNA. And then I took the Y DNA test and the mitochondrial DNA test with family tree DNA. So
Okay.
there are other companies out there that you can do DNA tests with. Those are the 3 that I've done.
Okay.
And I have not done autosomal DNA tests with
Okay.
family tree DNA.
All right. I was thinking about doing family tree. So, okay.
At the end, I'll talk about it a little bit because there's transferability that saves you money. So let me just mention.
Oh,
that at the
excellent.
end.
Okay. I'll hang on.
Okay, so who's your audience? Well, it's going to be your blood relatives that are going to care about this story you write, interested third parties, and probably not a publishing company unless you're a descendant of the Kennedys or the Rockefellers. The types of nonfiction writing for genealogists would include biographies. Biography is a story of a person's life written by third parties, detailing the events, places, and other happenings in your life in chronological order. An obituary is a type of biography, although an obituary might start out, this person entered eternal life on a certain date or whatever. There's the autobiography where you are the main character and you're telling your story in the first person. And then there's the memoir. Now the memoir is written to be a cohesive story, not just a collection of facts. And there are different types of memoirs that could be written. You can write stories from moments of your life or a transcript of an interview of one of your relatives. You could also focus on specific aspects of life, such as addiction, parenting, faith, disease, and so on. When you write those type of memoirs, you might want to consider the scenarios where you want to accurately represent what happened to avoid potential libel and defamation suits by some of your relatives. You could focus this around a house, a farm, a business, or old photos. So in Norway, they have these big observer kits or farm histories. And it could be the history of a company where you have ancestral connections, or you could be a physical or digital photo album that you put together with a narrative. Now, there are other types of nonfiction writing, expository. You're probably not going to be doing that. Self-help, this presentation would probably fall under that category. And the one I'm really going to focus on later on is the narrative nonfiction, which is going to be your all-inclusive family history story that will probably fall short of a literary nonfiction novel, but it should be a well-crafted, compelling, true story that can include interviews, parts of biographies, obituaries, memoirs, historical events, photographs, parts of your own autobiography, and more. Okay, so now I would let Ancestry.com compose a biography for you because they do that. You put facts in, such as a military record or residence records from city directories or census records, passenger records, and Ancestry will take those records and they will write a little story for you here. And then you can go to edit and then you can expand the story.
Mhm.
Now, as far as memoirs I've written, I wrote a father and son memoir, 2 generations of the Hague Howe ownership. Actually, in Norwegian, Hague sounds like Howe, and that's how Hague turned into Howe. The first one was at Nord Odel and Hedmark, and the Big Zerver kid, I think that's how you pronounce that, provided the first story for me, and I fashioned second story in the Norwegian tradition. So the house memoir that I wrote was of my great grandfather who built a house at 930 Forest, which is now 930 North Memorial Drive in Racine. And the house was built around 1880.
It's a 1200 something.
But it has since it was renovated back around 1976. There was a big story in the newspaper about it in 1976. The person who bought the house gutted the whole house, and he didn't have any money left over for windows, and so the house had no windows, and that was like against the city code, and so it got written up in the newspaper. Now, of course, there was more going on at the Haug farm than the eldest son Hans giving up his claim to his sister Lena and her husband Ole Johansson in 1865 because Hans's wife was not happy living on the farm. It turns out that Debbie and Darcy's great-grandmother, Martha John's daughter, Mobratton, was my second great-grandfather, Eric Hansen Trosey Haig's aunt. Martha was still living when their great-grandfather, Ole Olsen Berg Hillerud, immigrated from Norway to Racine, Wisconsin as a single man in 1882. And Ole settled within a mile of my great-grandparents. And my great-grandfather also had a sister named Karen who arrived a lot earlier in 1855. And she was a charter member of the Trinity M&E Church, where Ole and Anna Marie Peterson married in 1891. So, it's unlikely, we figure it's unlikely that Ole just randomly selected Racine, Wisconsin when he left Norway in 1882. He had family here, even though there was a somewhat distant cousin, but
I think we
sure
figured second cousin at that point.
what?
Second cousin, maybe?
Second cousin once removed.
Oh
Yeah.
boy.
Now, house history is also going to include both sides of the family. Now, Chuck Johnson, who's also on this call, is not related to Debbie or Darcy, but Mrs. Howe was Chuck Johnson's great-grand-aunt. His grand-uncle, also known as a great-uncle, commonly referred to as a great-uncle, William Johnson, died at the Howe House in 1896. And the article read over here from the Racine Times that William Johnson died at the home of his aunt, Mrs. Edward Howe, 930 Forest Street, at 10 o'clock last night of malarial fever, age 19. Malaria was a problem back in 1800s in Wisconsin. I know you think of malaria as being a subtropical or tropical disease, but they did have it in Wisconsin. Less than a month ago, he was one of the healthiest looking young men in Racine. He leaves 2 sisters and 3 brothers. The funeral will take place from the house Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Now, Chuck Johnson will tell you that his grandfather, William's brother, was a little younger, and he was sent to the orphanage when their father died in 1895. Oh, and also a day later, somebody wrote a nice appreciation of my great-grandmother in Racine Journal News. And I added the picture of her. That was not in the paper. Okay, when writing your chronological family history in a narrative nonfiction form, if you take anything away from my talk today, I want you to take this one. I would suggest that you write 4 stories, one for each of your grandparents' family tree. So the logic behind it is that your siblings, your children, and your grandchildren can read all 4 stories. Your aunts, uncles, and first cousins can read 2 of the 4 stories. Your second cousins can read 1 of the 4 stories. Third cousins can read 1 of the 4 stories and ignore the family history of the spouse of their great aunt or uncle. End the story no later than the year that your grandparents' last sibling died. Other sweet spots might be the year you were born, the year you left your parents' nest, the year you married, or the year your grandparent died. You know, it's all going to depend on, you know, what the overlap is on this. Do include obituaries of your aunts, uncles, and cousins after this date. You can include newspaper articles about your parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, and cousins after this date. And avoid reporting too many personal details of the lives of your living relatives after this date. Then write a fifth story in the first person. Perhaps you as the family patriarch or matriarch. Your 5th story starts with your birth and continues
No, I don't need it. Thank you.
to the
Bye.
present. Unlike a true autobiography, though, it's not necessarily all about you, but narrow the scope of the story to your more immediate family, parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, first cousins, and only close second cousins. There can be overlap with your other 4 stories. That's fine. Be mindful of your audience. The abridged stories of your life and others closer to you can be expanded in this story. Your parents will probably be adults in this story and likely children and young adults in your previous story. So now in this 5th story, I thought it might be interesting to include my ethnicity by country of origin. And of course, if you're talking about children or nieces and nephews, you would be a subset of them, which would be of interest to them because of that. So I happen to be these percentages of the following ethnicities. And the pie chart was made in Microsoft Excel. It's very easy to do. You just put the numbers in there and click on pie chart. It'll make it for you, and then it'll let you change the colors. I tried to change the colors to represent the flags of these countries and things like that.
That's a good idea.
Oh, that is, yeah, I didn't realize that.
So then I also had a chart. Now, as I said, I took the MyHeritage and Ancestry DNA tests, and so did my sister. So I decided to combine the results of the 2 tests and combine the results of my sister and myself to come up with a composite average of the regions to maybe get a better picture of where everybody came from. And these ethnicity estimates that they put up, usually they like to go back to, Columbus, so that all the indigenous people and the Americas are in the Americas, and all the Europeans originate from countries in Europe, and Africans in Africa, and so on. And so this is what I came up with in terms of percentages. I appear to be more Norwegian than the 25% that I would expect based on my Norwegian heritage. So some of my German ancestors must have came from Norway and Sweden and came down into Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody from North Africa must have came to Germany too. I don't know.
It's interesting how you and your sister are so different in percentages.
Well, it's kind of potluck. You get half of your DNA from your mother and half from your father, and you don't necessarily get the same halves.
Right.
And the same thing happened with their parents and their parents.
Mhm.
So does anybody have any questions up to this point?
I have an ignorant question. I don't know how I get my hands on a census.
Oh, well, they can be on microfilm in the library, in many libraries, and that's how it used to be. Or if you subscribe to Ancestry.com, you'll automatically be able to look at censuses. In fact, they'll have these little flags, and you can look at hints, and they'll find them. They'll find the different censuses on different years for some of your relatives for you.
Family Search too, which is free.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay. And later on, I'll show a picture of a census too. Okay, now I have 10 rules for nonfiction writers. Actually, they're posted by this Jerry, and so I decided to borrow them because I thought they were good. Know what's important. Tell the real story, not your story. Quote accurately and in context. Spell names correctly. Don't use cliches. Use short sentences. Use short paragraphs. Be careful with your punctuation. Be interesting and not boring. And leave out parts that readers tend to skip. For example, the current recession has been tough on small business. The readers are going to go, yeah, why did he or she put that in there? I mean, it's obvious.
I have a question on the
Okay.
previous one. When it says to use correct names, do you use all the other, or do you mention all the other iterations anywhere else?
Mention
Like-
correct names.
Spell correctly, you mean?
Yes, and I have a lot of, Edna is Ida is, all that, and is all those types of things. Do you
Well-
mention the incorrect names or the incorrect spellings anywhere? Because that might be what somebody's going by as well.
Well, the first time I mentioned the person, I put the entire correct name in there, and then I might put Ida or whatever in parentheses,
Okay, or like at a footnote or something then?
or I'll say it right after.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I have a lot of that.
No, I've never put anybody in a footnote like that.
Okay.
Okay, okay, you want to avoid plagiarism. You want to give credit where credit is due. When writing your family story, it's unlikely you're going to run into a problem with plagiarism until you find a biography of one of your ancestors in a book, or the memoirs of one of your relatives that they posted on the internet, or you try to incorporate historical events into your story. For example, commonly known historical facts such as on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, does not need to be quoted from a source. However, if you were to say, on December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, you just plagiarized the phrase, a date that will live in infamy, from Franklin D. Roosevelt's speech before Congress the following day. In fact, I shouldn't have put that in quotes for my example. So you want to use an online plagiarism checker. Some are free with limitations, but it might be worth the cost if you're a student or you want to get your work published. When in doubt, put it in quotes and cite your source. Use inline quotes. The day after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Franklin D. Roosevelt said before Congress, quote, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, ... quote. And then you might say, when Aunt Betsy heard this on the radio, she jumped up and said, why those? And I won't, you can fill in the rest. However, if you don't have a direct ancestor response to a quote like that, then I would just say, Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and Uncle Bob got drafted 2 weeks later. Then if you have a really long quote, or you're going to use whole paragraphs or something, then you're going to want to put that in block quotes and indent. And if you want to make comments or corrections to what they're saying, then I'd put those in parentheses and initial them. Now, do include a biography at the end, a bibliography at the end, I mean. Doesn't take long to forget where you got your information from.
That's true.
Don't wait to the end, because there is no end, only your last update. There are strict Mla and Apa rules on margins, spacing, indentation, fonts, italics, and so on. I might not have followed them to the letter here, but I've included some samples from a book, a pamphlet, a memoir on the internet, newspaper article, and an interview. You might also want to add an appendix. For example, on my dad's mother's side, they had a cottage on Pewaukee Lake from 1921 to 2000. And I went to the Waukesha County courthouse, and they copied down all the real estate transactions from 1921 to 2000. And you don't want to put all that in the body of your work, but you do want, but it was interesting. They talk about things like in 1921 or 23, or 1923, they're going to put up poles for electricity someday. And it took till 1937 for them to actually get electricity, but because they were in the town of Pewaukee and not in the village. And so this cottage was on the north side of Pewaukee Lake. You want to, there are copyright considerations. Now, there's no copyright in data from the federal government. Pre-1924 plat maps, for example, would fall under the public domain category. As for a photo from a book, as long as the source is cited, it should fall under a fair use policy. And when it comes to fair use factors, I think you can boil it down to this. If you're going to publish something and you want to make money off of it, you're probably going to have to be real careful about using copyrighted works, because the person's work you're using is either going to want a royalty from it, or they're going to want you to take it down. If the purpose is nonprofit education, like we're doing here, you have more leeway in using copyrighted works, but you still want to cite your sources, give credit where credit is due. So what's a chapter? A chapter can be used to break up time, locations, it can break up the focus, it can be used to break up ideas. I have a lot of chapters in my writing, but some of the chapters are only 2 or 3 sentences long. And I don't want to give up a fragment of information just because that's all I know about something. So a literary critic might criticize me for that, but I'm not writing a fiction work. These chapters don't necessarily have to be, I don't have to have a new page for every chapter. I just have a title and then I go on. So you're likely to have too many characters in your story to develop them sufficiently in a literary sense, because you want to include all your cousins and aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews and everything else. So unlike a published novel, there will be no finite beginning, middle, or end to your story. You're always going to be trying to go back farther in history than you are right now. And time marches on and you'll have new things to write. Does anybody have any questions up to this point? Okay, read while you write. Back in 1975, in January, I was in the Navy and I was home on leave. And I decided to go over to my grandparents' house and interview them. And my grandfather pulled out a piece of paper that was written on the back of a bank deposit slip. He pulled it out of the family Bible, and he said, "This is my grandfather, August Miller, born May 17th, 1825 in Saxony, Germany. He died December 26th, 1891 near Charles City, Iowa, in Niles Township. He married Wilhelmina Pape, born October 2nd, 1829 in Freeman, Kasselreich, Hessen, Germany." And here I have an actual village. And she died on June 4th, 1881 near Charles City in Niles Township. They moved to Charles City, Iowa from Nybramen, Cook County, Illinois. It wouldn't be spelled like that, but that's an attempt to write something in German phonetically. In Cook County, Illinois, on March 7th, 1872, very specific about the date. And they said that Nybramen, which is actually New Bremen, is now Dentley's Park, Chicago. Well, actually, it's not. It's Tinley Park, Chicago, but we'll find it out later. Okay, and during this interview, I got some additional information from my grandfather. My grandmother was sitting there too, but she was holding her head. And what I found out later was after I had been talking to them for about 3 hours all afternoon, then my grandfather said, "Well, I have leukemia and your grandmother has a brain tumor. And we're not going to be around for very long. So it's a good thing you came over here to get this information."
Oh,
And she died 3 weeks later, and he died 3 months later.
wow.
No.
And I was not able to attend either one of the funerals because I was on an aircraft carrier. Well, anyway, he told me that Miller was originally spelled Mueller, the German spelling, and that August and Wilhelmina married in Chicago sometime around 1850. And he said that August, and now he got this information from his father because his grandfather died before he was born. So August Miller would not let his family go to church in the United States because his childhood family was forced to go to church back in Saxony. And he said that August had a grocery store in Cook County that went bankrupt. They had to hide money from August because if he had a nickel, it would be spent. The cabin near Charles City, Iowa was so poorly insulated that they had to brush the snow off their blankets in the morning after waking up. It's one of these stories, you know, and they strung the clothesline from the barn to the house, you know, because the snow was so deep, you know, that stuff, and walking to school and everything. Yeah. His father, Henry Miller, went into the grocery store business in Charles City, Iowa, with his brother in the 1880s. And after August died in 1891, his father moved to Chicago and started a grocery store there. Then Henry married Agnes Gutzmer from Milwaukee in Chicago on the 20th of January, 1894. Henry's grocery store went bankrupt when Coxey's army marched on Washington, D.C., and he never recovered financially. After that, he drove a tea wagon up and down the city streets to sell tea and coffee to the housewives for the Great Atlantic Pacific and Tea Company in both Chicago and Milwaukee. My grandfather, he was born on the 4th of June, 1896, and they moved to Milwaukee from Chicago on a whaleback boat. And at first I thought he said a whale. I thought he said whale boat, and I'm going, a whale boat on Lake Michigan?
Not too commercially sound.
So now I have enough information to write a short story. So on the left here, I wrote up just about everything that I just read, so there's no need to go over it. And there's a picture of Henry and Agnes
That's nice.
on the right. It looks like their wedding picture or something, or something close to it. So before 1995, a physical library with books and microfilm was my primary option to answer some of my questions that I had, like who was the king of Saxony that forced everyone to go to church? Where is Brahman and Dentley's Park in Cook County, Illinois? Well, the answer to that is it's really Tinley Park, Illinois, in Cook County. And it was New Bremen, and then they shortened it to Bremen. The grocery store in Cook County, I've never been able to find it. I have a theory that maybe this grocery store was started in the 1850s, and maybe August Miller went bankrupt in the panic of 1857. Can I find the Miller family in the census? Well, I did. Well, they got missed in the 1860 census, but I found them in 1870 and 1880 on the microfilm. What was going on in the Chicago area in late 1871 or 1872 that might have influenced their move to Iowa? Where was the grocery store of Henry Miller's in Chicago in 1894? Well, I only found out the answer to that one about 2 months ago when Ancestry.com suddenly showed the marriage certificate of Henry and Agnes, and it gave their address in Chicago on Archer Avenue. And I looked it up on Google Maps, and it turns out that the building's not there anymore, but the site is now the Chinese American War Memorial.
Oh.
It's in the north, on the north end of Chinatown. What was Coxey's army, and why did they march to Washington, D.C.? Well, the whole thing started with the Panic of 1893 and the Depression that followed. And Coxey's army was a group of people that were marching to Washington to protest. And this occurred in late March and early April of 1894. And therefore, that tells me what the date was, or the approximate date of the bankruptcy of Henry Miller's grocery store, even though it had nothing to do with Coxey's army. And of course, what is this whaleback boat he was talking about? Well, there it is. I found pictures of the whaleback boat in the Milwaukee Public Library in their photo collection. And they let me take time exposures of the pictures as long as I didn't use a flash. So now I can picture my grandparents' family loading up all their furniture on this boat, getting on board in Chicago and sailing Lake Michigan to Milwaukee.
They're really zillions.
So how hard could it be to learn who the King of Saxony was back in the 1825 to 1850 time frame? It would be 2019 before I had the answer. See, prior to German unification in 1871, the German Confederation consisted of 39 states, 7 of which had the word Saxony in them.
Oh gosh.
You can see the one in blue was the correct answer. It was a duchy run by a duke.
How did you determine that was the correct one?
Well, we're going to get to that later on.
All right.
We're going to get to that later on. Now, after doing some of the research, after doing some research in the library, I understood why my second great grandfather's aversion was to going to church. And I'll read what I put in here. When August was 5, the rulers of the German duchies and kingdoms began to crack down and imprison pastors of rebellious Lutheran sects who refused to respect the 1817 proclamation by King Frederick William III of Prussia that Lutheran sects unify, coming on the 300th anniversary of the Reformation. Church attendance by the subjects of the kings and dukes was made mandatory around 1830 when many failed to comply voluntarily. Now, this was in the days before universal literacy and the printing technology of the 1840s that allowed for the mass production of newspapers. The church was where the common person got their news and decrees from their rulers, as well as prayer, religious instruction, and a sermon. And I guess if you were 5 years old, that might have made an impression on you. And I don't know what else happened in the family. Okay, so then my grandfather said that my second great grandparents were married sometime around 1850 in Chicago. Well, I found the passenger record of my second great grandmother, and it turns out that she arrived in New York on the 30th of August, 1854, on the ship, the steamship F.W. Bremen, with her father, August Pape, 58. And here he is right here, August Pape, 58, male. His occupation is peasant. And they came from Freeman, and that, of course, tells me that I have the right people, because that's what was written on the back of that savings deposit slip. And he came with his daughter, 24, and there were apparently two other people from Freeman that were also passengers on this ship. I don't know whether these two people were relatives or not. I'm still researching their names to find out. At any rate, they could not have married in 1850. I'm guessing they married about January or February of 1855, based on her arrival in 1854 and the birth of their first child later in 1855.
That peasant means.
Now, if I go way back, when I was looking at microfilm back in 1975, you could see that we have Illinois, Cook County, Bremen Township, and there's August Miller in the 1870 census. And there's my great-grandfather, Henry. And when I saw this for the first time, I said, oh, look at that. My great-grandfather had siblings. And they were all born in Illinois. And the value of their real estate was $750. And the value of their personal property was $600. Now, if you look at the farmer below here, his farm was worth $7,000. They had $2,000 worth of property, but I believe his farm was twice the size of my second great grandfather's farm. And the one up here is worth $3,600. Now, that was about the same size as this farm, but this farm was, I was told, was a poorer quality. We'll get to that part later. At any rate, so let's go to the Google Maps and take a snapshot of Tinley Park as it relates to its position to the Chicago Loop. And as you can see, back in those days, it would have taken you about 8.5 hours to walk. And after they built the railroad tracks, this would have been the route right here that went through Blue Island and goes to Tinley Park. The location of the two farms, I will find out later. That would be 2 dots right about here, where the arrow is. So the farms were about 25 to 27 miles, 25 miles southwest of the Chicago Loop, the way the crow flies. Now, in case you were wondering how I got that screenshot from my smartphone into this PowerPoint presentation, the way you do that is you can bring up your screen on your smartphone or a screen on your computer. So for the smartphone on an Android, you want to press and hold the power and volume down buttons at the same time until you hear this little snap. And then you've taken a picture. On an Apple iPhone, simultaneously press and then release the side button and the volume up button. And when you let go, it will take the picture automatically. You can either email it to yourself or connect your smartphone to your computer via a USB port. Then just copy and paste the photo to your Word document or PowerPoint slide. On your computer, it's even easier. Just press the print screen button key and then right click and paste the photo to your Word document or a PowerPoint slide. So about a little over a year ago, I decided to see if I could find August Miller's farm on some plat books. And I found them in both 1861 and 1870 along what is now 159th Street and Harlem Avenue, next to a farm owned by an L. Gantz, another 73 acres in 1861. And just for the heck of it, and the farms were located right here where I have the little red star. It says A. Miller, and it says A. Miller. And I confirmed that this was August Miller by looking at the neighbors the surrounding neighbors, and then looking at the census to make sure that those were the neighbors in the census. So that because Miller is a common name. And just for the heck of it, I decided to look up Gantz in Ancestry.com to see whether there were any public family trees with that name in there. And I found them because some of their descendants have put up family trees, and some of them have even taken DNA tests. And his wife's maiden name was Miller. 19 years old. She was 19 years older than him, Sophia Miller. And I'm thinking, wow, I don't know. Think maybe they're related. But at any rate, before I did that, I decided to take all the information that I gathered from the passenger records and from the plat maps and the research I did at the library, and I decided to update my story. So what I haven't read, I made some corrections and updated the story. Now, does anybody have any questions up until this point?
Not till I go to do it.
Yeah.
What?
Not till, yeah.
Oh,
When we try to do it, we'll say, where is that David Miller?
okay. Enhancing your story with DNA. So how am I going to prove that Sophia Miller Gantz on the next farm was related to my second great grandfather, August Miller? She was 19 years older than him. So my guess is that Lorenz Gantz and Sophia might have been his aunt and uncle. She could have been an older sister. That's also a possibility. And to this day, I don't know for sure. But while the Gantz family was also from Saxony, Miller is the most common surname in Germany, so that doesn't necessarily mean anything. Proving this, though, would be a real coup, because the death record at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Will County, written in German, states that their daughter, Louise Gantz Schoenstein, was born in Beinerstadt, Gottum, Sachsen-Menninger, Deutschland. Today, that would be Bernerstadt, Kreis Hindenburghausen, Thuringen, Germany. I probably didn't pronounce some of these right, but so the question is, can I find a fifth cousin who is a direct descendant of Lorenz and Sophia among my DNA matches, or those of my Aunt Jackie, her daughter, or my sister on Ancestry or
No.
Well, I had no luck when I typed in Gantz, but I typed in show instead, and I got a hit.
Hmm.
One Melissa Peterson. And I went and I looked at her family tree and followed up, and I said, "Wow, that's the family." She just didn't go back one more generation with her tree.
Hmm.
So I wrote her a message.
Hmm.
She was a DNA match to my Aunt Jackie. 9 centimorgans over one segment. And I wrote to her, and I explained to her how we were related, and that it would make us fifth cousins. And I found out a few things about Lorenz and Sophia. They came over with their children. That would be her great-great-grandmother, Louise 14, Carolyn 11, Rufine 7 on the SS Julia from Hamburg, arriving in New York on 11 June 1853. Now, too bad I can't find the Hamburg departure record that would tell the village that they came from, but however, we are not out of luck. After all, at the time Louise died, her church burial record noted the place to the village, Weinerstadt. So that's how I found out where my second great-grandfather was probably born, either there or in a surrounding village. So now I inserted my newfound knowledge about the Gantzes into my story as well. Okay, now it's time to take a field trip. Since I know where the farms were, I wanted to take a trip to Tinley Park. Does anybody have any questions up to now?
Exciting.
Okay, so here we go. You think nobody would live there since 1872? So do you think I'm going to find anything?
Well, maybe.
So
Exciting.
I went to Tinley Park on a Sunday afternoon that I knew that the Tinley Park Historical Society Museum was going to be open. So this was in November of 2019. And when I walked in, I was greeted by Ed Simonson Breitbarth. He was a curator there. And I started telling him about these 2 farms, the Gantz and the Miller farms, and where they were located. And he goes, "Oh, you mean the Breitbarth farm?"
Huh?
So it turned out that Ed is the great-grandson of the man who bought those 2 farms. I don't know whether he bought them in 1872 or whether he bought them from some other owners after that in the 1880s, but the farms were in his family until around 1980.
Pretty cool.
So, what are the odds? So he's going around showing me artifacts from the farm. I don't know if any of them went back further than his ancestors, but that was very interesting.
Yeah.
You're very lucky to find that connection.
Yeah. So I went there to see what the farms look like today.
I recognize those words, that lyrics.
And the Gantz farm is now in a big shopping center with a Menards. And a little farther east or a little farther west, there's a Hobby Lobby at the Miller farm, and over my shoulder would be the Tinley Park Plaza. So that's what's there today. So now I was also in contact with Brad Bettenhausen, and he's the president of the Tinley Park Historical Society. And I didn't meet him when I was down there, but I got his email address and we did some correspondence. And he told me that from the northeast corner of the Gantz property at 159th Street and Oak Park Avenue, he told me it was the highest point in Cook County. And that on a clear day, you can see the tops of the Chicago skyscrapers from there. It's on the subcontinental divide separating the Mississippi River Valley from the Great Lakes. So at that point, you're about 171 feet above Lake Michigan. So imagine the view that the Millers must have had on the night of October 7th, 1871, in the days with no electric lights, 25 miles off to the northeast, that huge red glow in the sky on the horizon, while someone was making a trip to the outhouse in the middle of the night. The massive plume of smoke by daylight, and I'm talking about
Chicago
Great Chicago Fire.
1871. Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Now I had a relative, an ancestor, that tried to say that the Miller grocery store burned up in the Great Chicago Fire, but I don't think so. My grandfather never said anything. My grandfather never said anything about the fire in relation to the grocery store. In fact, he never even mentioned the fire, which I find surprising. And in the aftermath of the fire, just like the aftermath of coronavirus, I think, people needed a place to live. Or maybe the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, in the surrounding properties like Baton Rouge, the value of the real estate surged because people that still had money needed a place to live while they could rebuild their stores or property or whatever it was in Chicago. So property values went up in the surrounding areas, and turns out the Millers left Bremen, Tinley Park, and moved to Charles City, Iowa, as was mentioned by my grandfather in their deposit slip on March 7th, 1872, only a few months after the fire. And according to Brad Bentenhausen, he said that the $750 value in 1870 was probably accurate because much of the Miller farm was of low quality for farming. He had records available to him that I didn't have. But Brad said there was also a large outmigration of people in the area in the early 1870s, in particular to Charles City, Iowa, according to church records. He said the railroads were offering free train tickets to encourage people to move out along its railroad line, Charles City, Iowa being along that railroad line. And Brad said he once attended a wedding of one of his relatives in Charles City, and they visited the cemetery, and they found it was full of names he was familiar with from Tinley Park. So I found out way more by going there than I ever thought I was going to find. Now, back in 2010, I did a field trip to the Miller farm in Niles Township in Floyd County, Iowa. And when I went to the courthouse, I looked at the record, and the Millers paid twice for this farm what their farm was worth in 1870, just a year and a half earlier. So I believe that somebody offered them, made them an offer they couldn't refuse on their farm in Iowa, and they took that money and headed west, and they could buy a bigger farm. Now that farm, I'm sure that green building wasn't there back in the 1800s, but the cabin was in here someplace, and they owned this field here, and they owned property on the other side, and it was probably a gravel road back then, and it's still a gravel road. So I have more things to write up, and I added it to my story. And my only advice here is, unless you're a descendant of Mrs. O'Leary, there's probably no need to regurgitate the details of the fire. Stick to your ancestors' experience, because if people want to know more about the Chicago fire, they can go on the internet, or they can go to the library and get books on it. Otherwise, you're going to make your story too long. That's my only point there. So,
do you mention that the Chicago fire happened or anything in case somebody didn't know?
oh, yes, I do.
Yeah, I see.
In fact, this is what I wrote here. By 1870, Lorenz and Sophia Gantz had moved, but the northeast corner of their farm at 159th Street and Oak Park happens to be one of the highest
yeah.
points in Cook County, 171 feet above Lake Michigan on the subcontinental divide. Imagine the view the Millers who were still there and the
Oh, yeah.
neighbors had on the night of October 7th, 1871, during the Great Chicago Fire.
Yeah.
Okay, when there were no electric lights, the glow on the northeast horizon 25 miles away, and the massive plumes of smoke as daylight broke with the whole city on fire.
Yeah.
So I do mention it.
Yeah.
And then
Because I mean, I knew the Chicago fire happened, but I couldn't have told you the date off the top of my head.
Oh, and then what I say, with so many people homeless, those who still had resources began to bid up and buy farms in the surrounding countryside, especially along the rail lines. According to Tinley Park historian Bradley L. Bentenhauser, there was a huge migration out of migration of people of migration out of the area. I guess I'll have to correct that. In the 1870s, many of whom went to Charles City, Iowa. So I did put all that in my write-up. Now, there are 3 DNA tests that you can take. There's the autosomal DNA test that'll find all your ancestors, but probably only 8 to 10 generations back.
That's pretty good.
But that test is the most helpful test for doing genealogical research. And it's also the least expensive of the tests. There's the Dna Chromosome Test. That'll take you back, take your paternal line back to DNA atom. So it'd be it's my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, his great-grandfather. So it's your father's 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 fathers, all the way back 200,000 years. And you can do the mtDNA mitochondrial DNA test, and that'll take your maternal line all the way back to mitochondrial Eve, 200,000 years back. And both males and females can take the mitochondrial DNA test, but you have to find a male family member to do the Y DNA test. So I did the Y DNA test, and this is what I got from Family Tree DNA. Now it's an expensive test, and you don't really get a lot of information from it. I think they get more information from it than I did. The Miller paternal line belongs to the haplotree I, specifically haplogroup I-M253, as predicted by Family Tree DNA. It says here that the haplogroup I dates back 23,000 years ago or older, and the IM253 linkage likely has its roots in northern France. Today it is found most frequently within Viking Scandinavian populations in Northwest Europe, and has spread down into Central and Eastern Europe, where it is found in lower frequencies. Haplogroup I represents one of the first peoples in Europe. Now notice I put it in block quotes because I quoted Family Tree DNA verbatim. And I might also add that Chuck Johnson, who was on this call, also took this test, and he is also I-M253. Now his male paternal ancestor is in Norway. Mine ended up in Eastern Germany. I could say, yeah, it's the long line of Millers, but he would say, well, it's the long line of Johnsons. Well, Johnson only goes back to 1846 in his family. And Miller probably doesn't go back any farther than 500 years in my family, because people didn't have surnames before then. So Family Tree DNA also shows you a lot of maps. You know, they want you to put, where's your, they want to know where your oldest ancestor is that you know about. So I put mine in, you know, Weinerstadt, Germany. And when you look at the map, it seems like most of these people migrated into the British Isles or into Norway and Sweden and Denmark. And there were only a few in Germany. There was only one other Miller in Hanover, Germany. So that person might have been my closest match. And they give you a map of the route your ancestor took to get to wherever you ended up. So Adam is down here in Kenya, and the first mutation occurred in South Sudan, and the second mutation in Sudan, and the third mutation in Ethiopia, and the fourth one somewhere in Saudi Arabia or Iraq, and the fifth one took place in Turkey. And then all the I mutants went, you know, up through northern France into Scandinavia and into the British Isles and things. And I must have had an ancestor that either took a right turn into Germany or came down from Sweden into East Germany. I don't know.
Some Viking came down from Sweden and
Yeah.
went to Germany.
So that's my presentation. Does
Lovely
anybody
presentation.
have
Thank
any
you.
questions?